Late 1944, somewhere over the Philippine sea. The sky was a furnace of sunlight and smoke. Far below, the ocean shimmered like polished steel, but at 20,000 feet, the world was chaos. A squadron of Japanese F6M fighters sliced through the clouds, engines screaming as they dove onto a formation of American aircraft moving steadily toward the Philippines. The Japanese pilots had seen this many times before. Enemy planes caught off guard, burning, spiraling into the sea. They lined up their shots with confidence. The first bursts of 20mm cannon fire tore through the wings of a U.S. Navy Hellcat, shredding fabric, punching holes straight through the fuselage. Oil streamed into the wind. A Zero pilot watched the American fighter dip, wobble, and then, impossibly steady itself, another Hellcat took hits to the engine cowling. Black smoke pouring out like a death sentence. Still it stayed in formation. Still it climbed out. The Japanese pilots blinked in disbelief. They had hit these American planes hard, direct hits that should have torn them from the sky, but the American aircraft refused to fall. One pilot murmured into his radio, voice shaking, "Why? Why won't they die?" The age of fragile aircraft was over. The age of machines built to take punishment and bring their pilots home had begun. By late 1944, the war in the Pacific had entered a brutal new phase. Japan's once dominant air force, the same force that shocked the world at Pearl Harbor, Malaya, and the early Philippines campaign, was now fighting a very different enemy. The United States no longer fielded the lightly built, vulnerable aircraft of 1941. Instead, it brought machines forged from industrial power, advanced engineering, and lessons learned from every defeat of the early war. The skies above the Mariana Islands, the Philippine Sea, and later Okinawa became the proving grounds for this shift. Japan's elite pilots, already fewer in number than before, were forced to confront aircraft they didn't understand, planes that absorbed hits, took damage that should have been fatal, and still kept flying. Much of this shock came from the contrast between American and Japanese design philosophies. In the early war, Japan had dominated with aircraft like the A6M, a plane famous for its agility, range, and dogfighting finesse. But its strengths came at a deadly price. It had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and minimal structural protection. A few good hits often meant instant destruction. American aircraft designers drew a different conclusion. After experiencing devastating losses in 1942, they focused on survivability. Companies like Grumman, Boeing, North American, and Vought began creating aircraft with rugged frames, thick plating around the cockpit and engine, and crucially, self-sealing fuel tanks that prevented the fires and explosions Japanese pilots were so accustomed to seeing. Japanese fighters that once shredded early American planes now faced Hellcats, Corsairs, Mustangs, and especially bombers like the B-29 Superfortress, all engineered to endure. A B-29 could lose 2 engines and still fly home. A Hellcat could take cannon shells through the wings and keep fighting. Even Avengers and Dauntlesses, slower aircraft on paper, were notoriously hard to bring down. Japan's pilots, trained in an era where a few bullets could down most aircraft, had no reference point for this kind of resilience. For them, aerial combat had always been a matter of maneuvering, precision, and decisive bursts of fire. Now facing American planes that seemed to ignore damage, their expectations collapsed. Reports of indestructible American aircraft began circulating through Japanese squadrons. Pilots described hitting a bomber for several minutes, watching flames burst from the engines, only to see it continue flying, somehow capable of making it back to the Marianas. This wasn't just a tactical shock, it was psychological. The Japanese aerial doctrine had always emphasized courage, skill, and sacrifice, traits rooted deeply in Bushido. But courage couldn't stop a .50 caliber armed Hellcat that could take everything thrown at it and still climb away. Skill couldn't match a bomber with redundant hydraulics, electric turrets, and structural engineering designed to survive catastrophic hits. And sacrifice, the very core of Japan's fighting spirit, now found itself running into a new kind of enemy, machines designed not to die. The Pacific skies were shifting, the era of fragile dogfighters was ending, and the sudden, stunning durability of American aircraft would reshape the battles to come. The shock Japanese pilots experienced in late 1944 and 1945 didn't come from a single battle. It came from a fundamental difference in engineering philosophy. One that became glaringly clear once the air war turned into a grinding test of endurance rather than finesse. Japan's aircraft industry had been built on speed, maneuverability, and long-range striking capability. This approach had worked brilliantly in 1941-1942, the A6M0, Ki-43 Oscar, and early Ki-44 variants dominated the skies because they fought in a world where dogfighting superiority meant life or death. Their light frames and thin aluminum skin allowed for astonishing maneuverability, giving Japanese pilots the unmatched turning radius they relied upon. But the trade-off was catastrophic. No armor, no protective plates, little redundancy, and fuel tanks that ignited the moment they were hit. What made early Japanese aircraft superb predators also made them fragile prey. Meanwhile, American engineers were moving in the opposite direction. They built planes that could get hit sometimes brutally and keep flying. The Grumman F6F Hellcat, often nicknamed the aluminum tank, was a flying embodiment of this philosophy. It carried thick armor on the cockpit, heavy engine protection, rugged landing gear, self-sealing tanks, and a high-power Pratt & Whitney radial engine that kept turning even when riddled with shrapnel. The F4U Corsair, with its inverted gull wing design, was equally fearsome. Its massive radial engine could absorb incredible punishment, and its frame could withstand the stresses of both carrier landings and high-speed dives, conditions that would tear apart lighter Japanese aircraft. And then came the B-29 Superfortress, a machine so advanced that Japanese pilots once described it as a fortress above the clouds. Its systems were overbuilt for survival. Pressurized compartments, fire suppression, system self-sealing tanks, route-controlled, gun turrets, multiple redundant controls, ability to fly on two engines for hundreds of miles. To Japanese pilots trained to kill bombers with a few well-placed rounds, the B-29 seemed supernatural. Many witnessed engines burning, yet still watched the aircraft climb higher, turn south, and vanish into the distance, headed back to the Marianas. Japanese reports began revealing consistent patterns. We struck the wing. It did not break. The pilot compartment was armored. Their machines continued to fly, even when clearly damaged. Bombers with trails of smoke did not fall. These observations shocked senior commanders. The old belief that fate, courage, and precision determined aerial victory no longer matched reality. Japan's best pilots were now fighting machines that simply endured. Compounding the problem, Japan's industrial base was collapsing. They struggled to produce enough aluminum, spare engines, and fuel, let alone armored aircraft. Their factories were dispersed, damaged, and left without the production capacity to match America's industrial machine. In contrast, the United States was mass-producing durable aircraft at a pace never seen before. Even if a Hellcat or B-29 returned full of holes, American crews repaired it overnight. Japan, by 1945, could barely replace the planes it lost, let alone repair the ones that limped home. Thus the stage was set, a clash between aircraft built for maneuver and aircraft built for survival, between a warrior culture shaped by sacrifice and an industrial power shaped by engineering. And soon, in the intense battles of late 1944, these differences would erupt into moments that Japanese pilots would never forget. Angle 1. The technological angle. Why American aircraft refused to die. What stunned Japanese pilots most was not American tactics, it was American engineering. For decades, aircraft survival meant avoiding damage. Now, American designers embraced a revolutionary concept: build planes strong enough to survive damage, not just evade it. This shift began with the brutal lessons of early 1942. U.S. aircraft were torn apart in China, the Philippines, and the Solomon Islands. Engineers studied every wreckage and every pilot report. The conclusion was unavoidable: American pilots didn't lose because they were unskilled. They lost because their machines couldn't take hits. By 1943, the response was taking shape. Self-sealing fuel tanks became standard. These layered rubber and fabric tanks swelled when hit by hot metal, sealing bullet holes to prevent explosions. Japanese pilots, accustomed to watching enemy fighters erupt into flames, suddenly found their rounds punching into American wings with no fire, no smoke, no catastrophe. Radial engines, air-cooled and staggeringly durable, became the beating hearts of Hellcats, Corsairs, and Avengers. Unlike Japanese inline engines, radial engines could absorb shrapnel, oil leaks, and cylinder loss without complete failure. Some pilots returned with half their cylinders gone. Armor plating protected cowlings and cockpits. What Japanese pilots thought was a clean kill often ended with the American pilots still flying, wounded but alive. Redundant control systems meant that even when cables were cut or hydraulics damaged, backup systems kept the aircraft maneuverable. And finally, overbuilt frames gave American aircraft the strength to remain airborne even when torn open. Photos from the Pacific show Hellcats returning with elevator cables destroyed wingtips, missing tail sections, shredded holes, the size of helmets through the fuselage, yet they still flew to Japanese pilots. This was incomprehensible to American engineers. It was the plan all along. Angle 2, the human angle. Trust in a machine that would bring you home for American pilots. The toughness of their aircraft wasn't just machinery, it was faith. Every man who climbed into a Hellcat or Corsair knew that his plane wasn't fragile. He knew he wasn't flying a machine that would betray him with a single hit. This confidence changed everything. Pilots attacked with aggression, dove through anti-aircraft fire, fought outnumbered, and pressed assaults even when riddled with holes. They took risks Japanese pilots would never dare because they trusted that their aircraft could carry them through. Stories from the Pacific fronts became legend. A Hellcat returned to its carrier with the entire right horizontal stabilizer shot away. Corsair limped home with 375 bullet holes, yet the engine still purred. ATBF Avenger flew 600 miles with a torpedo still jammed in its bay and a shredded wing. One B-29 flew back to Saipan with 3 engines dead, half its rudder gone, and a fire still smoldering in the wing. These weren't miracles, they were engineering victories, turned into human courage. Psychologically, Japanese pilots were shaken by this resilience. They fought enemies who refused to fall. They fired into wings that should have torn off. They watched oil leaks that didn't cause crashes. Each returning American aircraft chipped away at the Japanese belief that skill alone won wars. Each surviving pilot reinforced the American belief that courage meant enduring, not dying. Angle 3, the enemy angle, shock, confusion, and the collapse of an aerial doctrine for Japanese pilots. Everything they knew about air combat was suddenly wrong. They had trained to win through precision, agility, and superior maneuvering. Their doctrine relied on light frame stight turn shy climb, retespulate skill, carefully placed bursts at close range. But this doctrine collapsed against American aircraft, built like flying fortresses. Japanese combat reports from 1944 to 45 contain phrases rarely seen earlier in the war. We hit them, but they did not fall. The enemy aircraft absorbed our fire. They continued to fly even while burning. One pilot wrote after a particularly brutal engagement near Formosa, "Their planes are armored like warships. A zero cannot kill them with the firepower we carry." Another described firing an entire ammunition load into a B-29's wing, only to watch the bomber slowly turn into the clouds and escape. The shock wasn't just tactical, it was emotional. Japanese pilots, raised on the belief that courage determined victory, were now battling machines that obeyed only physics and engineering. No amount of bravery could compensate for their aircraft's fragility. This realization eroded morale, deepened fatalism, and fed the growing belief that Japan was losing, not because its pilots lacked courage, but because its machines lacked protection. American aircraft didn't merely survive hits, they destroyed the enemy's confidence in their own doctrine. Angle 4, the industrial angle, factories that won the air war. Behind every durable American aircraft was an industrial engine unlike anything Japan could match, where Japanese factories fought shortages of aluminum, rubber, fuel, and trained labor. American factories operated with abundance, precision, and relentless output. Grumman's Iron Works became famous for building aircraft so rugged that the workers joked, "If it folds, fix it with more metal." The F6F Hellcat rolled off assembly lines with almost obsessive structural reinforcement. The engineers understood that naval aircraft faced conditions, carrier landings, battle damage, ocean storms that demanded frames built far beyond standard tolerance. Boeing, meanwhile, mobilized tens of thousands of workers to construct B-29 Superfortresses in plants the size of small cities. These factories used precision jig assembly * uniform, rivet systems, interchangeable parts, redundant wiring harness, advanced machining tolerances previously unseen in wartime. Every structural component was intentionally overbuilt. Every critical system had backups. So when a Japanese pilot fired into a B-29's wing and saw it keep flying, he wasn't witnessing luck. He was witnessing industrial strategy turned into air power. Japan simply couldn't replicate this. Their factories struggled under bombing, lacked metals, and relied on hand craftsmanship rather than mechanized production. Their fighters were agile because they were light. They were light because they lacked materials. The skies revealed this imbalance brutally. American aircraft weren't just durable, they were the airborne symbols of an industrial titan. Angle 5. The tactical angle, how durability became a weapon. Durability didn't just help American aircraft survive, it changed the way American pilots fought. Early in the war, dogfights hinged on turning ability, surprise attacks, and close-quarters maneuvering. But by 1944, the U.S. Navy and Army Air Forces embraced a new philosophy. Fight with the plane you have, not the plane the enemy thinks you have. This meant head-on attacks instead of evasive spirals, diving into anti-aircraft zones, and trusting armor, engaging bombers and fighters, even when outnumbered, staying on target longer, because the aircraft could absorb punishment. Hellcat and Corsair were both designed around .50 caliber firepower, high durability, and superior climb rates. They didn't need to outturn a Zero. They could simply outlast it, outgun it, and survive hits that would kill a Japanese plane instantly. Tactically, this flipped the Pacific Air War on its head. Hellcat pilots began using boom dash and dash zoom strikes, fast, aggressive hits that ignored enemy attempts to lure them into turning fights. They could dive, hit, climb, and come back again, taking glancing fire without fear of catastrophic failure. Bomber formations used durability as a strategic shield. A B-29 group could take the first wave of interceptors, lose an engine, tighten formation, and continue on course. The Japanese fighters attacking them often suffered worse losses simply by trying to penetrate the gun coverage and armor. In short, American survivability reshaped air combat rules entirely. Japan was still playing the 1941 game. America had moved to 1945. Angle 6. The psychological, moral angle when valor meets. Machines that don't break for Japan. The emotional collapse caused by durable American aircraft may have been more damaging than the physical losses. Japanese pilots were raised in a doctrine rooted in Bushido, the belief that courage, skill, and willingness to die ensured victory. Their machines reflected that philosophy: light, fast, deadly in a dogfight, but fragile. By contrast, American aircraft reflected their own national values, engineering soliloquical superiority. When these philosophies met in combat, the psychological impact was devastating. Japanese pilots who emptied their ammunition into a bomber or fighter and watched it continue flying experienced something deeper than frustration. They experienced the collapse of an entire worldview. What did courage mean against a machine that simply would not fall? What did sacrifice mean when the enemy didn't need to rely on it? As the war progressed, the psychological shift intensified. Interviews with surviving Japanese pilots reveal words like helplessness, Futility, bewilderment, inevitable defeat. One veteran said decades later, "Their planes were not stronger than we were. They were stronger than what we believed war could be." The realization that technology had overtaken heroism changed the entire moral landscape of the Pacific. War. The sky was no longer a contest of spirit, it had become a contest of engineering. And in that new arena, Japan was already defeated. November 24, 1944, high above Tokyo, the air was thin, frigid, and trembling with engine noise as the first wave of B-29 Superfortresses approached the Japanese mainland. This was the beginning of a new kind of war, one that Japan was not prepared to fight. The bombers cruised at altitudes where most Japanese aircraft struggled even to reach, their silver wings glinting in the clear blue sky. For Japanese defenders, the sight was shocking. These aircraft were enormous, bigger than anything they had faced before. But as the interceptors climbed, the shock turned into disbelief. They opened fire. Cannon shells exploded against aluminum skins. Machine gun rounds stitched across wings. Some B-29s smoked immediately, flames licking from engines damaged by the attackers. The Japanese pilots expected the usual outcome: a wing detachment, an explosion, a spiraling dive to the ground. But instead, something impossible happened. The bombers simply kept flying. One B-29 took a full burst of cannon fire to its right wing, its engine coughing out flames before sputtering to silence. Instead of falling, the aircraft banked slightly, leveled out, and continued toward Tokyo on 3 engines, then later 2. Its gunners kept firing back, creating deadly crossfire that killed 2 of the interceptors. Another Superfortress was hit squarely in the nose. The canopy shattered. The bombardier was killed instantly, but the pilot held steady, using secondary controls to keep the massive aircraft stable. The Japanese fighters followed, pouring more fire into the wounded giant. Smoke streamed behind it like a banner of survival. But even in that condition, the bomber turned, climbed, and began the long, agonizing withdrawal toward Saipan. It should have been impossible, but it was happening right in front of them. The Japanese pilots radioed back, "These aircraft do not fall. We have hit them." They continue, "We cannot understand." More reports followed as the B-29s released their bombs over industrial districts. Anti-aircraft fire hammered the formations. Entire wings glowed orange from the heat of near misses. Holes the size of fists, or in some cases, the size of helmets, appeared in fuselages. Yet the bombers remained in formation. When the attack ended and the American planes turned for home, the Japanese pilots watched, stunned, as damaged aircrafts and trailing black smoke, others missing engine cowls, several flying with only half their control surfaces, continued to climb toward safety. The most shocking sight of all was a B-29 with its entire tail section partially shredded. The vertical stabilizer had gaping holes. The horizontal stabilizer was nearly severed. Yet the aircraft maintained enough stability to escape. To the Japanese defenders, this moment represented a turning point in the war. They had seen damaged American aircraft limp home before, but never on this scale, never with this resilience, never with this kind of overwhelming engineering superiority. Even senior officers were shaken. Reports filed after the battle contained language rarely used in Japanese military communications. "Our weapons appear insufficient. We are unable to produce the results expected. The enemy's aircraft have unexpected strength." For the first time, Japan's air leadership confronted a truth they had long avoided. The American machines in the sky were no longer just aircraft. They were symbols of an industrial and technological power Japan could no longer match, and the psychological collapse that began over the Philippine Sea was now spreading over Tokyo. April 1945. The Battle of Okinawa. If the B-29 raids over Japan had introduced a new fear, Okinawa carved it into the minds of every Japanese pilot who faced the American fleet. This wasn't just a bombing campaign, it was a storm of aircraft, a relentless wave of machines that seemed impervious to destruction. Kamikaze pilots, many barely trained, took to the skies with a single mission: cripple the American invasion force. Their aircraft were packed with explosives, fueled for one-way trips, and guided by a philosophy of total sacrifice. Japan hoped that sheer willpower could bridge the technological gap, but what they witnessed instead shattered that belief. As kamikazes dove toward American ships, they were intercepted by F6F Hellcats and F4U Corsairs aircraft, built like flying armor plates. Kamikaze hits were devastating, but what stunned the Japanese pilots most was what happened in the air. Before they struck, Hellcats absorbed explosions that should have ripped them out of the sky. Corsairs took cannon shells through their huge radial engines and kept climbing. Avengers returned to carriers with entire sections of their tail missing. One encounter became legendary among both sides. A kamikaze struck an American Hellcat in a glancing blow, tearing off half the wing. The Japanese pilot, in his final seconds, saw something he could not understand. The Hellcat did not disintegrate. It rolled, dropped in altitude, and then using its massive engine power stabilized. The pilot limped it back to the carrier, skidding onto the deck with sparks and metal scraping behind it. Word of this spread among Japanese pilots like a haunting myth. Even when struck, the Hellcat survives. Another moment occurred when a Corsair escorting a bomber group was hit by flak and a Zero simultaneously. Its oil pressure dropped to nothing, its entire right stabilizer was severed, and yet the pilot kept it level long enough to guide the bombers home. He crash-landed on a beach after almost an hour in the air. The Japanese ground forces who witnessed the landing were stunned. Many believed any aircraft in that condition should have fallen apart long before, but the most dramatic event of all came during a late-war interception near Kyushu. B-29 was hit by flak that ignited one engine and damaged two others. A Zero pilot saw the bomber burning, its tail rattling, and assumed it would fall, but the bomber didn't dive. It climbed slowly, painfully, but steadily. The Japanese pilot followed, firing again. More flames erupted. Parts of the wing peeled away. Yet the B-29 held course. He later reported, "It flew with the strength of 10 planes. It refused to die." The bomber eventually reached the coastline and disappeared toward Okinawa, leaving behind a Japanese squadron that no longer believed their weapons could stop the American advance. By mid-1945, Japanese commanders admitted the truth bluntly: "We cannot build aircraft that endure as theirs do." And in that moment, the psychological warfare ended. Not through intimidation, not through propaganda, but through cold, undeniable reality. American aircraft could take hits, survive, and strike again. Machines had replaced myth. Engineering had replaced sacrifice. And for Japan's pilots, the war in the air was no longer merely unwinnable, it was unimaginable. When the smoke finally cleared over Okinawa, a brutal truth had emerged with unmistakable clarity. Japan's Air Force was not simply losing the war. It was being outclassed by machines that rewrote the rules of survival. American aircraft returned to their carriers full of holes, their wings shredded, their engines coughing smoke. Yet again and again, those aircraft brought their pilots home. Flight decks became galleries of twisted metal and miraculous survivals. Mechanics walked around damaged planes with looks of disbelief, pointing at torn fuselages and ruptured armor plating that somehow hadn't stopped the aircraft from flying. For the Americans, these returns were moments of grim relief. For the Japanese, these returns were moments of psychological devastation. Many Japanese pilots who survived Okinawa later admitted that morale collapsed not from defeat in combat, but from the feeling that nothing they did mattered. Their bullets ignited fires, but the fires didn't kill. Their cannon shells tore wings, but the wings held. Their tactics, once brilliantly effective, felt powerless against aircraft that behaved more like warships than fighters. By mid-1945, Japan's air units were fighting with dwindling resources. Aircraft quality suffered. Many new pilots received only hours of training. Fuel shortages forced them to fly at reduced power settings. Spare parts were so scarce that units cannibalized one aircraft to repair another. Meanwhile, the United States was mass-producing aircraft at a speed Japan could not fathom. In a single month, American factories produced More Hellcats than Japan could produce fighters in 3 months more. Corsairs than Japan had fuel to operate Temur B-29 components. Then Japan could counter with anti-aircraft guns. This industrial tidal wave meant that even damaged aircraft were quickly repaired, returned to service, or replaced entirely. American air superiority wasn't just a numerical advantage. It was an engineering ecosystem that guaranteed constant readiness. Japan's pilots faced a nightmare scenario. Even when they succeeded in hitting an enemy plane, they rarely succeeded in destroying it. This imbalance reshaped every major air engagement. During the defense of Formosa, Japanese commanders reported that B-29s returned again and again, regardless of how many times they were struck. Pilots firing at Hellcats often found their rounds bouncing off armor plate or merely scarring thick outer skins. The result was a growing sense of fatalism. Japanese diaries from this period contain entries like, "Their machines cannot be stopped. We fight the steel, not the pilot. Our planes burn. Theirs endure." This wasn't exaggeration. It was observation. Asterisk, as the war dragged into its final months, Japan relied increasingly on kamikaze missions, partly because traditional aerial combat was no longer effective. If fighters couldn't shoot down American aircraft reliably, then pilots were forced to crash their planes into targets. But even that strategy began to fail. Many kamikazes struck American ships only to find the vessels remarkably resilient. Multiple hull compartments, fire control teams, and heavily armored carriers prevented catastrophic losses, just as American aircraft survived punishment in the skies. American ships survived punishment at sea. By summer 1945, Japan's air war had become a tragedy. Brave pilots facing industrial giants, beautiful but fragile aircraft, facing machines built to survive anything. The aftermath of this imbalance was clear. Asterisk. Japan was losing not because its pilots lacked courage, but because its aircraft lacked protection. The Pacific Air War had proven one truth. Above all, durability was deadlier than speed, and survival was a weapon. In the final months of the Pacific War, the consequences of America's aircraft durability became unmistakable, not only on the battlefield, but in the reflections of the men who survived it. Japan's pilots, engineers, and commanders were forced to confront a truth they had never trained for. The enemy's machines were evolving faster than their ability to destroy them. After the surrender, Allied intelligence teams conducted interviews with Japanese pilots from elite units men who had fought over China, the Solomons, the Philippines, Formosa, and Okinawa. Their testimonies formed a striking pattern. Many pilots admitted that by 1944, they no longer believed they could reliably shoot down American machines, unless the American pilot made a mistake. One former Zero Ace compared the experience to fighting a boulder with a sword. He described moments of scoring direct hits on Hellcats, watching armor plates spark under cannon bursts, and feeling a sinking dread when the aircraft refused to fall. Another pilot recalled seeing a B-29 with an engine on fire and assumed it would explode, only to watch it climb higher. In his words, it climbed like a wounded animal determined not to die. Japanese mechanics and engineers, too, were shocked during post-war examinations of captured American aircraft. They found armor plating thicker than expected fuel, tanks that sealed punctures before flames could, spread control systems that survived damage through mechanical backups wiring, harnesses protected by multiple layers engine, mounts designed to hold even when cylinders were destroyed. One engineer remarked bitterly that Japan could not have built similar aircraft even if they had tried. The country lacked the raw materials, manufacturing methods, and stable industrial centers required. The psychological toll of this technological disparity ran deep. Many Japanese pilots reported a shift from tactical frustration to existential despair. They realized that courage had limits, but American technology did not. The culture of sacrifice, once the pride of the Japanese military, now felt powerless against aircraft designed not for glory, but for survival and return. Meanwhile, American pilots who returned from missions with battered planes carried their own emotional weight. Their trust in their machines often meant the difference between life and death. Many credited their survival not to luck, but to engineering, the thickness of an armor plate, the integrity of a fuel tank, the unstoppable power of a radial engine. When the war ended, the impact of these differences shaped the future of aviation. Japan emerged from the conflict, determined never again to fall behind technologically. The post-war era saw Japanese engineers studying American designs meticulously, leading to a future industry known for durability, efficiency, and precision. In the United States, the lesson was equally profound. The war proved that aircraft survivability was not a luxury. It was a strategic weapon. Modern American fighters, bombers, and helicopters continued this design philosophy. Multiple redundancies, armored systems, damage tolerance, and engineering that prioritized crew survival above all else. The legacy of the Hellcat, Corsair, and B-29 lived on in every aircraft designed afterward. But beneath the technology lay a deeper truth. The Pacific Air War had revealed the limits of valor and the unmatched strength of innovation. Japan's pilots had fought with bravery beyond doubt, but bravery alone could not destroy machines built to endure fire, metal, and the sky itself. In the end, America's aircraft didn't just fly after taking heavy fire. They changed the meaning of what it meant to survive in war. In the final accounting of the Pacific Air War, historians often focus on the battles, the strategies, the aces, and the firebombings that shaped the outcome. But beneath all of these events lies a quieter, more profound truth, one revealed in the shocked voices of Japanese pilots who fought enemies they could hit, but could not kill. War, they learned, had changed. Skill and courage still mattered, but technology had become the deciding force in the sky. The aircraft that survived the Pacific were not merely machines. They were symbols of an industrial era that rewarded endurance over elegance, resilience over maneuver, and engineering over mythology. The American fighters and bombers that refused to fall did more than win battles. They shattered assumptions, rewrote doctrines, and ushered in a new era where survival itself became a strategic weapon. A Hellcat gliding home with half a wing, a Corsair flying with its control surfaces shredded, a B-29 limping across the sea on burning engines. These moments were not just tactical footnotes. They were warnings of a world in which machines would begin to outlast human expectations. For Japanese pilots raised in a culture where spirit was believed to triumph over steel, the war delivered a painful reversal. Steel properly engineered, overbuilt, redundant, and fueled by industrial power triumphed over spirit. Their courage never wavered. Their skill never diminished. But they faced aircraft built to deny them victory. Even when their aim was perfect, the Pacific skies became a crucible of truth. Bravery can inspire, but it cannot compensate for fragility. Sacrifice can motivate, but it cannot replace armor. Precision can wound, but it cannot defeat a machine designed to survive the worst that war can offer. In the end, the American aircraft that kept flying after taking heavy fire were more than machines. They were milestones in the evolution of warfare, proof that survival, not sacrifice, would define the battles of the future. And long after the smoke cleared, long after the engines fell silent, the memory endured. The planes that refused to die changed not only the war, but the very meaning of power in the skies.